July 12, 1943. Dawn light crawled over the shattered wheat fields outside Prokhorovka, Kursk salient. The air tasted of iron and scorched earth. Steam rose from a shell-pitted road as men and machines exhaled the chill of night into a humid summer morning. A thin mist hugged the hollows, while the first birds, if any dared, kept an uneasy distance from the low metallic tremor that presaged the day's work. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov hunched behind the armored canopy of his Ilyushin Il-2. His hands were steady, calloused, the knuckles white where the flight jacket's leather bit into them. Through a lens smeared with oil and condensation, he watched fields where columns of German panzers, Panzer IVs and Tigers, breathed diesel and heat, their silhouettes blotting the horizon. Petrov's rear gunner, Corporal Andrei Kozlov, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent half-grin that rarely met his eyes, kept a finger resting on the Browning-like 12.7mm DA machine gun, listening to the whispers of the airframe as if the beast itself spoke warnings. From below, the German column moved with a soldierly boredom. Unteroffizier Karl Müller of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment spat tobacco into the dirt and tapped the rim of a worn helmet with a practiced thumb. He had heard the stories. Soviet flying coffins clanking slow, doomed to fall to the nimble Bf-109 and FW-190. Müller and his comrades laughed at the thought that a lumbering two-seater could threaten their steel. The German mechanized men had chased off biplanes, outrun strafing runs, and webbed their own myths of invulnerability. They had no time for what they called Sturmoviks, a name scoffed over cups of coffee and whispers in mess tents. Above them, the two Il-2s from the 1st Guards Attack Aviation Regiment peeled off clouds like knives through wool. The lead, bearing the faded red star and painted nose scabbed with field repairs, throttled forward on a deliberate run. The pilots had a grim choreography: climb, cut, dive, flatten into the ground like hounds on scent, deliver rockets and cannon bursts, and claw back toward the smoky shelter of friendly lines. There was no heroism in the plan. There was only repetition, iron discipline, and a faith in the machine's armored back. Petrov's engine coughed, a shallow cough that settled him like a hand on the shoulder. He glanced down at the panel, no smooth modern glass to reassure him. Only a cluster of needle gauges, a compass that spun and stopped as if remembering directions. He remembered the feel of the Il-2 on his first solo, a rolling, humming bulk that resisted commands like a stubborn beast. Men called it slow, men called it ugly, men called it a coffin. Petrov, who had once watched a wingman burn and tumble into a field like a folding coin, knew the machine's truth. That bulk carried armor thick enough to swallow shrapnel, to let a man come home when lesser planes would not. A low whistle from Kozlov, 2 beats, meant the rear sector was clear. Petrov descended. The world scribbled into speed. The grass leapt up, craters became canyons, a line of farm hedges sliced into oblong shadows. He saw Müller now, a dot at the edge of a gun shield, checking a tank's flank. Petrov's breath came in measured pulls. He engaged the WWII-23 cannons, 2 quick checks, a squeeze, and felt the air around the Il-2 answer with recoil. The cannons barked twice, a twin-branch staccato that punched holes into the morning. Below, the laughter of the Germans stopped like a radio cut short. A Panzer IV took the first salvo amidships. Crewmen cursed and reached for fire extinguishers, then ducked as the second burst rattled the turret. The Il-2's guns shredded canvas and overturned the complacent geometry of German movement. Smoke began to bloom, black and bitter as ink, from a fuel tank hit and from earth, where a rocket had punched its report into the ground. The column's tempo collapsed into chaos. The neat confidence of march turned ragged as crews abandoned positions to fight for their lives. "Good hits," Kozlov shouted, though the words were swallowed by wind and engine roar. Petrov remembered the drill. Stay low, keep the frontal armor between you and the ground, feed the guns until the target breaks. He thought of his comrades, of the sergeant who had salvaged a wing flap with a pocket knife in a field just west of Belgorod, of the propaganda posters depicting sleek, mythic heroes. None of that mattered in the dirt and the smoke. The IL-2's armored bathtub, the heavy steel plate wrapping its engine and cockpit, took a ricochet that slammed into the fuselage like a fist. The frame shivered, instruments danced. Petrov's left wrist stung as splinters of wood from a nearby house, torn off by concussion, slid into the fuselage. Down on the ground, Miller peeled himself behind the lip of an overturned track and spat the taste of blood from his mouth. He had been sure the Sturmovik was a joke. The airborne menace was a slow, clumsy cow that couldn't outturn a fighter. Now he watched it perform a brutal, deliberate ballet. Not graceful, but deadly, a machine that traded finesse for the ability to come back. He saw crewmen go down in the open, hearsay replaced by the thud of reality. Something cold threaded through his chest, like fear, like understanding. By the time the Il-2 swung for the retreat, smoke and fire stitched the road into a scar. The opposing forces learned their first hard lesson that morning, not from textbooks or boasted rumors, but from the flattened patience of a plane they had mocked. Petrov felt the aircraft's frame rattle again as a machine gun burst nicked the tail, but the armored shell held. The Sturmovik looked like a coffin and flew like a tank. In that weird marriage, it carried the terrible advantage. In the months before that dawn over Kursk, the Il-2's creation had already been a story of skepticism, sacrifice, and stubborn genius. It began in 1938, when aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin proposed something no one else dared: a low-flying, heavily armored attack plane that could soak up punishment and still deliver lethal blows against tanks, columns, and infantry. The Red Army Air Force didn't quite know what to make of it. Traditional doctrine worshipped speed and maneuverability, dogfights, aces, and duels in the clouds. Ilyushin's concept spat in the face of that tradition. He wanted a slow brute of a machine, one that would fly through anti-aircraft fire, not around it. The high command scoffed. Engineers called it the armored turtle. Test pilots cursed it under their breath. But Ilyushin was relentless. He had seen the brutal lessons of Spain, where unarmored planes were torn apart by ground fire in seconds. He envisioned something different. A flying fortress for the front line, armored from nose to tail with thick steel plating. A plane that protects its pilot like a knight's armor, he said. The result was the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, Stormbird. Its body was an engineering oddity. Instead of the engine bolted onto the fuselage, the armor was the structure itself. A metal shell wrapped the engine, cockpit, and vital parts, turning the aircraft into a literal tank in the sky. Early test flights were brutal. The first prototypes flew heavy, sluggish, and temperamental. Pilots nicknamed it the Flying Coffin, not out of hatred, but because once it was hit, it often didn't come home. The rear gunner seat in particular was a death sentence, open, exposed, and without armor. In early models, it wasn't even there. The Il-2 started as a single-seater, which meant no one to watch the pilot's six. The Luftwaffe quickly learned to exploit that. German fighters would dive from behind, tear the Il-2 to ribbons, and vanish before the pilot could react. Losses mounted by the hundreds. Crews joked grimly that every new Il-2 pilot had a 10-flight life expectancy. By 1942, desperate letters from frontline squadrons reached Moscow. "We need gunners," they pleaded. "We need someone to watch our backs." Ilyushin listened. He redesigned the plane, stretching the fuselage, adding a rear gunner position and rebalancing the weight. The new version, the Il-2M, had thicker armor, improved 23mm cannons, and space for an extra man. That change transformed the aircraft's fate. Suddenly, German pilots who dove on Il-2s found themselves staring down a rear-facing torrent of 12.7mm fire. The easy kills were gone. The sky became a trap, with the Sturmoviks hunting low, appearing in swarms of steel and smoke. Soviet factories, meanwhile, worked like hives. In cities like Kuibyshev and Moscow, women and teenagers riveted the skeletons of Il-2s day and night. Sometimes, workers carved their names into the fuselage plates, quiet dedications to brothers or husbands at the front. Each machine carried not just metal, but human will. The pace was staggering. By mid-war, one Il-2 rolled out every hour. Stalin himself declared, The Il-2 is as essential to the Red Army as bread and water. That single line became gospel. Production soared to nearly 36,000 units, making it the most produced combat aircraft in history. But to the men flying them, the Il-2 was never a statistic. It was both curse and savior. Petrov had once scrawled a line on his cockpit with chalk before every mission. Fly low, fly straight, fly home. It was not poetry, it was a prayer. The pilots flew at treetop height, so low they could see German soldiers looking up at them, eyes wide, guns shaking. They learned to spot camouflage nets, the faint glint of armor, the dust trails of retreating columns. The Il-2 didn't win through elegance, it won through endurance. And as the Germans advanced into the Soviet Union, laughing at the clumsy Sturmoviks, they would soon discover that endurance was the deadliest weapon of all. For as the tide turned at Stalingrad and Kursk, the flying coffin would become something else entirely, a vengeful storm that descended without mercy on the men who once mocked it. July the 5th, 1943, the Battle of Kursk had begun. It was the largest tank battle in human history, an iron tidal wave stretching across the steppe, tens of thousands of machines grinding through dust, flame, and torn wheat fields. The sky was a ceiling of smoke and tracer fire. Every hour, hundreds of planes rose and fell in the same deadly rhythm. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov's squadron had been briefed before dawn. You are to stop the German armor from breaking through the southern salient. Hit their columns, hit their supply lines. Do not break formation. His Il-2's canopy fogged in the humid morning air as mechanics refueled the aircraft, sweat glinting off their brows. The smell of kerosene and hot metal filled the airstrip. Kozlov, the rear gunner, tightened the ammunition belt into the UBT machine gun, muttering, "Flying coffin or not, let's make them regret laughing." Moments later, the squadron's engines roared alive. 12 Il-2s rising into the amber dawn like a formation of iron geese. Below, the German spearhead was on the move. The Grossdeutschland Division and 2nd SS Panzer Corps, supported by Tigers and Panthers, surging north toward Prokhorovka. Their officers were confident. Recon reports claimed Soviet aircraft were slow, primitive, vulnerable. The Luftwaffe owned the sky, or so they thought. But this time the Sturmoviks came prepared. Petrov's group dove from 1,500 meters, cutting through anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like a swarm of burning insects. Shrapnel pinged off the armored plates with metallic screams. One Il-2 took a direct hit to its left wing. The pilot held it steady, releasing his rockets before cartwheeling into the earth. There was no time to mourn. The Germans below looked up in disbelief. The Sturmoviks weren't flinching. They came in head-on, armor plating glinting red through the smoke. The first salvo landed among the panzers. Rockets shrieked. 2 tanks burst into flames, black smoke curling upward. Cannon shells tore into half-tracks and fuel trucks, detonating in chain reactions. The entire column convulsed under the bombardment. Unteroffizier Karl Müller, still pinned behind the lip of his Panzer IV from that earlier morning, saw one Il-2 flying barely 10 meters above the ground. Its underbelly shimmered in the haze, riddled with dents but unbroken. It dropped its bombs with perfect precision, turning the road ahead into a wall of fire. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters, but the Germans were unprepared for the new 2-seat Il-2 formations. Each Sturmovik covered another's tail with interlocking fields of gunfire. Bf-109s dove in and were shredded by crossfire from rear gunners like Kozlov, whose twin barrels glowed cherry red. One German pilot bailed out, parachute blossoming like a pale flower against the dark sky. Petrov's squadron kept pressing, skimming the treetops so low that their prop wash flattened the grass. "Tanks ahead!" Kozlov shouted through the intercom. Petrov's heart hammered. He lined up his sights, waited for the shimmer of armor, and pressed the trigger. Twin 23mm shells slammed into the lead Tiger's turret. The gun jammed. Smoke spewed from its hatches. German tankers leapt out, faces smeared with oil and ash. The Sturmovik circled once, wings cutting through the oily heat waves, and Kozlov finished the job with a burst of machine gun fire that stitched across the field. By mid-morning, the battlefield was a nightmare of burning metal and shattered men. The Soviet ground troops, emboldened, advanced behind the black banners of smoke. In one flight, Petrov's unit destroyed 6 tanks, 4 armored carriers, and countless vehicles. Of the 12 planes that took off, 8 returned. 4 did not, but the German advance had stalled. On the ground, Müller and his comrades stumbled through the wreckage of their own pride. He stared at a crater still burning from an Il-2 rocket strike. The smell of scorched fuel and bodies clung to everything. Nearby, a captured Soviet propaganda leaflet fluttered in the dirt. It read, "The Sturmovik is your grave digger." For the first time, Müller believed it. That day, and in hundreds of sorties that followed, the flying coffin became something else entirely, the Black Death, as the Germans began to call it. Its sound, a low grinding hum like a saw through metal, became the nightmare of every Wehrmacht soldier on the Eastern Front. They no longer laughed when they heard it. Autumn 1943, the Eastern Front was changing color. The wheat fields of summer had turned to red mud, black smoke, and rain-soaked trenches. German armor that once rolled confidently toward Moscow now crawled westward under relentless pursuit. Above them, the skies no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the Il-2 Sturmoviks. In every village and every frontline airstrip, their presence was constant. The Soviets had turned the Sturmovik into a symbol, not of beauty or speed, but of vengeance. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov and Corporal Kozlov had survived more missions than they could count, and each one left its mark. The cockpit smelled permanently of cordite and oil, the metal scarred from bullet strikes and patched with makeshift repairs. Kozlov had taken shrapnel in his shoulder weeks earlier, but refused to leave. "As long as she flies," he said, patting the fuselage, "so will I." The Il-2 squadrons had evolved their tactics. Gone were the early chaotic strikes. Now formations of 12 or 20 moved like a hammer, slow, deliberate, devastating. Soviet Yak fighters flew high above them for cover, while the Sturmoviks prowled low, hunting tanks, convoys, and artillery nests. The Germans learned to fear the sound before they saw the planes. That low, rumbling growl that began as a distant tremor, rising into a scream that rolled across the steppe like thunder. Infantry dropped into ditches, tank crews abandoned their machines. Veterans called it the whirlwind of steel. Each sortie was a brutal lesson in precision and courage. The pilots flew at altitude so low that tree branches sometimes scraped their wings. Every approach meant threading a corridor of fire, from 20-meter flak cannons, MG-42 nests, and even small arms. Petrov often saw tracer lines crisscrossing his windshield like orange lightning. And yet somehow the Il-2 endured. The armor around the cockpit could deflect 20-millimeter rounds. The engine was protected by half an inch of hardened steel. Soviet pilots joked that the Sturmovik was a plane built by a blacksmith. It was ugly but immortal. During one mission near the Dnieper River, Petrov's Il-2 took 12 direct hits. One shell punctured the oil cooler, another ripped through the wing. Kozlov fired back until his gun jammed, screaming curses drowned by the roar of the engine. They limped back across the river, trailing smoke so thick it painted their path in the sky. The landing gear collapsed on touchdown, skidding them across the field, but they lived. Mechanics counted 78 bullet holes in the fuselage. Petrov said nothing as he climbed out. He simply lit a cigarette, his hands shaking, and watched the ground crews patching the holes for tomorrow's flight. "She's ugly," Kozlov muttered, "but she doesn't know how to die." The Germans had stopped mocking the Sturmovik. Now they cursed it. Reports described it as impossible to destroy except with a direct hit. Soldiers called it Betonflugzeug, the concrete plane. Whenever it appeared, discipline crumbled. Men dove into trenches, praying for the sound to pass. And still more came. By 1944, there were thousands of them. They covered the front from the Baltic to the Black Sea, swarming the German lines in great clouds. Each one carried the vengeance of a nation that had been invaded, starved, and burned, now returning the fire tenfold. When Soviet armies crossed into Eastern Europe, the Il-2 led the way. Bridges, convoys, rail lines, nothing survived its onslaught. Its 23mm cannons could tear open the roof of a Tiger tank. Its rockets could split armored columns. German reports began to use a new term in the margins of their after-action logs: Il-2 effect. It meant collapse. Even the Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was bleeding out. Its fuel was scarce, its pilots exhausted. The Bf-109s that once hunted Sturmoviks now ran from them, or simply failed to appear at all. For Petrov and Kozlov, every mission blurred into the next, a haze of smoke, blood, and vibration. But one day in the spring of 1944, as they returned from another sortie over Belarus, Kozlov looked down at the column of retreating German troops and said quietly, "Do you think they ever stop hearing us?" Petrov didn't answer, because somewhere deep inside he knew that they didn't. The hum of the Sturmovik, that growl of steel wings and vengeance, would haunt them long after the smoke cleared. April 1945. The war's final storm was gathering over Germany. The Red Army had crossed the Oder. The road to Berlin was a single churning artery of mud, armor, and vengeance. Every village burned behind them, every horizon pulsed with gunfire. And above it all, the Il-2 Sturmovik still flew. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov's squadron now operated from a forward field near Kustrin. Their planes lined up like sleeping beasts streaked with soot. Kozlov had grown quieter, his grin long gone. His face bore the hollowed look of a man who had seen too much sky, too many explosions. The Il-2 they flew was scarred from 3 years of combat, patched with plates of mismatched metal. Mechanics joked it was more repair than aircraft, but it still flew straight. On April 16th, as the Soviet offensive toward Berlin began, Petrov received his orders. Enemy reinforcements moving west of the Silo Heights. Rail lines, convoys, fuel dumps, destroy everything. He and Kozlov climbed aboard their battered Sturmovik. The wind bit cold and sharp across the plain. The engines coughed to life with a roar that seemed to shake the ground itself. Petrov looked once at Kozlov, who nodded silently, locking the canopy. The takeoff was rough. The runway little more than a strip of flattened earth, but once airborne, the old machine found her rhythm. The world fell away beneath them, a mosaic of ruined towns, fractured rivers, and columns of smoke stretching toward Berlin like black banners. The German retreat had become desperation. Fuel shortages left tanks stranded in ditches, half buried under camouflage. Ammunition was scarce, morale was dust. What once had been an army now moved like refugees. And above them, the growl of Il-2 engines echoed endlessly. When Petrov's squadron arrived over Silo, the earth below seemed alive. Artillery flashing like lightning across the hills. Soviet and German lines clashed in waves, a chaos of mud and fire. "Targets ahead," Kozlov said, his voice steady but hollow. Petrov leveled out at 300 meters. The first rockets screamed from their rails, streaking into the valley below. Each impact sent geysers of earth and steel into the air. Flames rolled through a column of vehicles. Another Sturmovik followed, its cannon fire walking across the ridgeline like a scythe. German soldiers broke and scattered. Some tried to fire, others simply ran. The Sturmoviks came again and again, flying so low that the blast from their rockets shook the helmets off men's heads. Below, an exhausted Unteroffizier Karl Müller, older now, limping filthy, pressed himself against a burned-out truck, watching the same machines he had once mocked 3 years before outside Kursk. They were not flying coffins anymore, they were executioners. He could feel the concussive force of their attacks in his bones, hear the grinding whine of their engines, like the roar of judgment itself. When Il-2 passed directly overhead, close enough for him to see the red star painted across its underbelly, a blood-colored cross over steel. When the last plane disappeared beyond the horizon, silence fell. Smoke drifted in slow spirals over the ruins. Müller looked around at what remained of his company, nothing but wreckage and dust. He remembered the jokes, the laughter in 1941 about Soviet scrap metal. Now there was no laughter left, only the smell of oil and the sound of distant engines fading into memory. In the days that followed, the Red Army reached Berlin. The skies above the burning capital swarmed with Soviet aircraft, Yaks, P-2s and Il-2s. They strafed the outskirts, crushed pockets of resistance, and carved open roads for advancing armor. On May 8th, the war in Europe ended. The Il-2s fell silent for the first time in 4 relentless years. Many would be left behind on airfields, bullet-riddled, patched, still carrying the ghosts of their crews. Petrov survived the war. Kozlov did not. He was killed by flak near Königsberg in the spring, his last radio transmission calm, as always. I see them. 2 tanks at the bridge. I'll finish this one. Then nothing. When the news reached Petrov, he stood by their grounded plane for a long time, running his hand along the pitted armor. In the metal, he could still see the faint scratches of Kozlov's name, carved years ago at Kursk. The Sturmovik never looked graceful, never earned the glamour of a Spitfire or Mustang. But it was the workhorse that carried the Red Army from the ashes of 1941 to the gates of Berlin. To the Soviets, it became a symbol of endurance. To the Germans, a whisper of fear. And to those who flew it, like Ivan Petrov, it was both tomb and salvation. The flying Coffin had crushed its mockers, one mission at a time. As Petrov walked away from his aircraft for the last time, the wind howled across the empty field, rattling the loose panels and echoing through the cockpit like a memory. The ghostly hum of a plane that refused to die. It was the sound of vengeance, of survival, of the Sturmovik.